afternoon and welcome everyone to the Burlington Township School District's, because this is our fifth session of Critical Conversations in our Community series. We are so pleased to have all of you here with us. We in the district have been focusing on various aspects of race relations, and our students have requested forums so that they too can share their feelings and share the impact that racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion has on them. My name is Liz Scott. I am the district's Director of Human Resources and Community Relations and a proud member of our district's equity team. This session is in view and hear only, and we do have a Q&A chat option that will allow you to submit questions to the panelists. The panelists are able to see those questions, and we will attempt to answer as many questions as we can live. If we're unable to answer questions during the session, your questions may be addressed during an upcoming Critical Conversations program. Our goal with these critical conversations is to bring about awareness, educate while providing a forum for productive conversation and interactive experiences. One thing that I always say in all of these sessions is that it's important to remember that this is not a race. It is a marathon, and you should expect and accept non-closure. This is an ongoing lifetime process without a finish line. And in our society today, we often want to feel some sense of closure, regardless of the issue. And when you're engaging in race conversations, there may be plenty of times when there is no closure. This is ongoing work that does not necessarily leave one walking away feeling like everything turned out the way you had hoped. But it's important that we all be willing to take risks and accept that much of this is about changing yourself and not necessarily others. We will be dealing with topics that can't be fixed in one setting because it is ever evolving. So remember, everyone is at a different stage in the process when it comes to having these conversations. We all have to be prepared to give and get grace, and we should give our neighbors room to make errors, just as someday each one of us will have to have the same grace given to us. It is important to understand that issues of racism, issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion impacts our students. And that's why this particular conversation is so important. And this is why I'm so pleased to see that so many people are tuning in to hear what our students have to say. Our students are our future. So we have an amazing panel tonight, and each panelist will be introduced, and they will reflect on what all of this means to them. Following the panelists' reflections, we have a very special guest speaker and panelist, Dr. Kelly Moore, who will speak on the topic of racism, activism, and our youth. This will then be followed by guided panel discussions. But at this time, I would like to introduce my co-moderator, Katina George. Katina?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Katina George, and I'm the Director of Counseling for the district and also a member of the Diversity and Equity team. I am grateful to be here with all of our students and watch them take steps in changing the world around them. I want to thank them for being part of the change, especially in their community. I also want to show some support for the advisors of the Black Student Union, Ms. Richardson, Mrs. Webb, and Mr. Chamberlain. Your support for the BSU will not go unnoticed, and it's awesome that you have stepped up and are working with our students. It's not easy being a 17 or 18-year-old right now, but our friends here tonight have taken their role in enacting change seriously, and we can all learn a little bit from them. I'm excited to hear from our students tonight and from Dr. Moore on how we can all take steps in making a difference. So we were very excited to have our students here this afternoon. This year, the high school started the Black Student Union. And this group focuses on issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's my pleasure to introduce a few members of the Black Student Union. Our first student panelist is Sheridan Leake. Sheridan is a senior at Burlington Township High School and a co-founder of the BSU. She serves in numerous organizations, including as executive board treasurer for the student government and a player on the girls soccer team who won the sectional championship. So after high school, she looks forward to majoring in biology on the pre-med track. She also intends to have concentrations in medical ethics and Spanish. Sheridan, please share how the events of the past year has affected you as it relates to race relations, equity, diversity, and inclusion.
So good afternoon. So for me, the events last year is actually what motivated us to create the Black Student Union. So those club meetings that we've had has really allowed us to just bring in more perspective to the issues that are going on. And we've had the pleasure of Burlington Township being a really diverse community. And so that this diversity includes our races, genders, religions, and social backgrounds. So that's really allowed us to have really, really beneficial conversations on the issues that are going on. So the BSU has definitely been one of the biggest things this year in my senior year. And I'm really glad that we've had the opportunity to create it and be a part of it and really just be pioneers in this movement in our personal community and especially our student community specifically. And also, it has affected me in kind of my interests. So as she said in my introduction, I really have an interest in medical ethics and medical inequalities, and that has stemmed from this past movement this past summer. I've always kind of been a science nerd, really stuck on that pre-med track, and just this past summer and this past year, I've been have a really growing interest in medical ethics. So and it raised my awareness to health disparities and inequities and unequal access to healthcare. So that's really kind of how this past movement has helped me and inspired me to create this organization with my friends in my school community, and also kind of helped me and kind of what I want to study in my coming years in college and hopefully in the future in my career.
Sheridan, thank you so much. And we are so proud of you, and we look forward to seeing amazing things from you. The fact that you and your friends got together to start the BSU, it just means a lot because, as I explained to the group before, there's a lot of history. It wasn't called BSU back in the day. It was called SURE, Students United for Racial Equality. And I know some of the attendees who went to Burlington Township know about that group. So it's important to keep that torch going. And we are just so thrilled that you took the initiative to pick up that torch and to just move forward. So thank you. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our next panelist, Grace Randolph. Grace is also a co-founder of the Black Student Union and a senior at Burlington Township High School. In addition to her school activities, she is an active member of her church community at Christ Baptist. After high school, she looks forward to pursuing an education in neuroscience with a concentration on health inequalities. Though through creating the Black Student Union, she has been able to engage in positive conversations concerning race. She hopes to continue having these conversations and making progress towards a more equitable future. Grace, please share with everyone how the events of the past year affected you as it relates to race relations, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Grace?
So, hi everyone. And like Ms. Scott stated, I am a co-founder along with Sheridan and our friends of the Black Student Union, and we just started this last year. And this past year really brought us closer together through starting it. But we created it because the past summer we felt angered by the lack of support. We felt like we didn't have enough people to talk to concerning the issues that we were being faced. So we felt as though we needed to create a community for us to have positive conversations. And we feel very lucky that the Black Student Union is the place where many people come to have these conversations. And we talk about a lot of different topics, and people are open to speaking about anything they feel is, weighing them down concerning, social issues and things of that nature. And I'm really grateful that we had this time to educate others.
Thanks, Grace.
Thank you, Grace. That is great. Okay. So it's my pleasure to introduce another member of the Black Student Union, John Zerillo. John is a senior at BTHS who's involved in running cross country and track. He has also played soccer. John's a member of the Science League Robotics and recently joined the Black Student Union. John is excited to have been invited by Grace, Sheridan, and many other excellent friends who are also involved. As for college, he's going to Rowan University, where he will be majoring in accounting. He'll be working towards a CPA license. John is really excited and honored to represent his school district tonight and be part of this critical conversation. John, please share with everyone how the events of the past year have affected you and how it relates to race relations, equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Thank you very much. And although I may not be a founder of Black Student Union like Grace or Sheridan, I do believe that I still have some credibility here because I am quite an active member in that club. So thank you very much. So good evening, everybody. First, I guess racially, I've had the chance to speak with a lot of different and new people and evolve my own personal perspective through the Black Student Union. And then I also recently had the opportunity to join Mr. Chamberlain's African American History course, where we compared historical events of the past to current events happening now. And just seeing the world from the eyes of another person can drastically change and has definitely changed how I view the world as a whole. I view each new person I meet in a different light, and I can get to learn them on a new individualized level. And it's really beautiful how many friends I've made along this new journey, and how many people I've gotten to speak with and get to know on a more personal level. And for me, that is probably one of the biggest accomplishments. And then finally, in terms of equity, I've sort of come to the realization equity isn't always about materialistic things. It can come in many, many different forms, such as criminal justice or overcoming societal standards or barriers or things of that nature. And altogether, it's just this whole past year has been crazy and a chance to evolve and in a new environment. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So again, I just have to say the fact that our students have come together to raise awareness, they have come together to revitalize a very important club. And although it's called the Black Student Union, it's not about just having all Black students together. It's about unification, which is what SURE was about all those many years ago, Students United for Racial Equality. And the fact that the BSU is doing the same thing, all of you should be commended, and we applaud you for your efforts. As I told you before we started the session, what you are doing now is leaving a legacy for those students who will come after you. So again, I, as an alumni, I want to thank you for your efforts, and I want to continue to encourage you. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker, who will also serve on the panel. And her name is Dr. Kelly Moore, and she is no stranger to Burlington Township. She is a friend of ours. She is a resident, and she's going to share her reflections and then speak to us about racism, activism, and youth. Dr. Moore is a clinical psychologist licensed in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. As a practitioner, Dr. Moore's clinical expertise is in the treatment of trauma and anxiety disorders in children and adolescents, with a specialty in the treatment of PTSD and OCD. Additionally, Dr. Moore has worked in efforts to disseminate evidence-based treatments and develop trauma-focused programs in community health in Philadelphia and New Jersey. Her work has focused on identifying facilitators and overcoming systemic barriers to implementation of evidence-informed practice and implementing trauma-informed care with multidisciplinary teams. And she is dedicated to education about how mental health services can be more accessible and applicable to BIPOC and LGBTQ communities. Dr. Moore is the director of the Center for Psychological Services, the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University. She received her BS degree in Human Development from Cornell University, her Master's in Education and Psychological Services from UPenn, and her Psych Doctorate in Clinical Psychology from Rutgers University. She is a proud graduate of Willingboro High School, class of '98, and is currently a Burlington Township resident, raising her 3 boys in district. Again, she is a friend of BT.
Thank you so much for having me, Liz and Katina, and to these amazing students. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I really want to get out of the way, because I'm just excited to hear from our youth and to just be invited. It feels really good to be a part of something that is really special. And I think just shows, I think a lot of what you all are doing, as you were describing, the impetus for starting your group at the high school is basically evidence of what I'm about to talk about, which is the power of activism in young people. So I'm not going to speak for too long, but I want to just share a couple of things about how racism does have an impact on people, and how activism can help to counter the impact of racism and really make a long-lasting change. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you all will be able to see. I'm guessing if you can't hear or see anything, just somebody shout out and let me know. But I want to talk about this intersection between racism, activism, and our young people. And I just want to start by making a couple of points about race and racism. And I think the type of people that usually come out to events like this are usually people that really care about this topic. But every once in a while, you have people that might join just because they're curious and may not know, and really do want to learn. And so in some ways, sometimes at these events, we worry that we're preaching to the choir. But I think as this conversation continues to not be on trend, but really be about a movement, I think more and more people will join us at the table. So the points I really want to touch on is thinking about prejudice versus bias, which is something I think is really an undercurrent of racism that is not talked about as much. And when we talk about the actions of people, we're really talking about how their prejudices and biases are playing out in the way they interact with other people. And then racism, in terms of a definition, thinking about this combination of prejudice plus power, because power is very important. But in addition to talking about power, I'm going to just say a quick point about the word privilege, which I think when we talk about privilege and how it relates to racism, a lot of times people think of privilege as if you have some kind of something special or something that's very grandiose. And I want us to really think outside the box and make it very simple. Sometimes we kind of limit ourselves, and I think we want to think broadly about what privilege actually means when we're talking about it in the context of race and racism. And then I'll touch on something that's kind of a concept in psychological literature, but I think is relevant across social context, which is the idea of racism being kind of part of the atmosphere. And I say it here, pollution in the groundwater, and I'll describe that in a moment. And then just kind of talk about how silence is violence and the role of not just having non-Black and brown folks a part of the conversation, but we really do need people that represent the majority. In any situation where you have a minority or an oppressed group, you need the group that is not within that group to be a part of the systemic change process, because they're the ones that are in a position of power. And so I'll touch on how activism is a way to use your voice in whatever way works for you. And so for the young people on the call today, you might want to think about people around you that that don't really bring this topic up or don't really talk about it because they're not sure how. And so how can we help them to use their voices in a way that feels comfortable for them, but also maybe pushes them a little bit out of their comfort zone so that they can truly be an ally and someone that stands in solidarity of this movement. I have a blog that talks about family wellness, and I talk about racism as a virus. And the reason why I say that is because over the last several years, we've come to learn a lot more about racism and how it affects the actual health of young people. And the American Academy of Pediatrics is now talking about racism as being a contributor to kind of the overall health outcomes of many children of color or people in communities where they're impacted by racism more broadly in terms of poverty, in terms of systemic housing issues and things of that nature. And so when I talk about bias versus prejudice, I just want to draw your attention to this image on the right. And so in this image, I talk about how you can see this kind of difference that this pedia.com came up with. But basically, bias is when you have a belief about someone or sort of an inclination about a person or an idea, and you view it in a way that it could be considered unfair, but it can be positive or negative. So a bias can be a positive attitude about something, but it results in unfair treatment. So an example I give of this is how we tend to think that women are better caretakers, like naturally they're just better, this belief that they're naturally better caretakers. And so the unfairness result is that women tend to be in a role of caretaking even at their own peril. So asked to do more in the house, asked to do more within families, asked to do more within the community, because there's this bias that women just naturally have more of an inclination to be better nurturers. So that's an example of a bias, because it's not necessarily a negative thing to think someone's a good caretaker, but it does result in a sort of a heavier burden being put on those people. And then on the flip side of that, prejudice is usually rooted in a negative belief. And then the result is much more powerful because it can result in full-on discrimination. So if you think about housing restrictions that were very prominent when as Black folks started moving from the South up to the North to escape Jim Crow, a lot of cities then created these laws or these districts that they were only allowing Blacks to move into certain areas. So there's a prejudice about what it means to have a diverse neighborhood, and then they created laws to enforce those negative attitudes. So that's where prejudice becomes dangerous, because when discrimination is usually happening as a result of someone being in power, creating something that then pushes certain people into certain situations that then end up in a situation where maybe they don't have as much access or opportunity. So when we talk about privilege and white privilege in particular, which some of you might have heard about this term, white privilege, and I know it tends to kind of make people feel uncomfortable to hear that terminology, but I just want to use this quote here. And there's a really great essay called White Privilege by someone named Peggy McIntosh. And she talks about white privilege in this really basic way that is so straightforward that I think, after reading that, I read it as a college student in a class called Race, Power, and Privilege. And I had never actually heard the term before. So this is going back to 2002 when I took this class. And that was the first time I ever heard this term, white privilege. But it was written by a white writer who wrote this essay. And throughout the time of me reading about white privilege, I came across this quote. And it said, number one, white privilege doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard. It means your skin tone isn't one of the things making it hard. There's plenty of other privileges. So there's socioeconomic privilege, there's male privilege, there's heterosexual, cisgender, Christian, able-bodied privilege. But white privilege is perhaps the most enduring throughout history. And the reason is because it's the thing you can see. So usually privileges that are seen without having to know anything about you are usually the things that kind of give you that edge or push you back. And so when we think about white privilege, prejudice, and power, these things taken together are really what help to construct what we now know as racism in our country. So when people say things like, well, I'm not a racist, or my friend's not racist, or this person's not racist, but racism is a social system. It's a system we all live in, right? So it's a process, it's an outcome. And so it benefits from that combination of privilege, power, bias, all these things taken together, and the laws we've created. If you think about the first police officers in the United States, they were slave hunters. When we think about the way that our educational system has been structured, early schools were segregated. And in fact, schools still typically are pretty segregated depending on where you live, who's in your school. Township, we're very diverse. So I think we have a very unique situation, but many schools across the nation tend to be pretty segregated because of where people live, where people get to live, where people work, who gets wealthy, who doesn't, who gets land, who doesn't, what farmers get crops and what farmers don't get crop loans and things like that. All that's rooted in a history of sort of legal systems, policies, and procedures that have been set up for some groups to benefit and some groups to kind of be held back. But I think, the thing that's even more oppressive about racism is the impact on the psychological, because what happens to us in our minds and mentally, how we are impacted by the world around us, is what really harms our ability to connect with other people and really see them as humans and not see them as their color, right? So Kenneth Hardy, who is a prominent psychologist, talks about racial oppression, and he talks about it as like a trauma. So he says it's a traumatic form of interpersonal violence which can lacerate the spirit, scar the soul, and puncture the psyche. So he talked, this conversation about racism is kind of in the air and it's in the water. So it's there. And what we're trying to do now is we're trying to reckon with where all this came from. And there's lots of different ways to do that. But what I think is happening in our district is students like you are coming together to have conversations that are not always comfortable, but very necessary, and then figuring out how to make these changes that will be small but mighty collectively over time. It makes a big difference. Because it's not enough for someone to say they're not racist or to actually think that they're not racist. Because as Martin Luther King said, in the end, we're not going to remember the words of our enemies. It's the silence of our friends. So I'll give you an example, like watching the insurrection happen on Capitol Hill, or hearing the things that have happened over the years with Black Lives Matter and the movement kind of re-energized by even going back to Trayvon Martin and things like that. I don't really remember a lot of things that people said that were blatantly, obviously racist. What I remember is the people that didn't say anything, like thinking about people I thought would have something to say or speak up, my friends at work, people I went to school with that were just silent. And to me, silence is complicit. When you don't say anything, to me, you're saying that you don't see anything wrong with it, not even to reach out to me directly. So to all the young people here, think about the people in school that don't say anything at all about this, don't seem to show up for any conversations about this. Not to say that they're bad people. It may just be that they don't know what to say, they don't know how to say it, they're afraid, or maybe they do agree and they just don't want to say anything to offend you. So it's important to pay attention to who's not talking just as much as it's important to pay attention to who is talking. And I just want to touch on this for the parents on the call, that the impact of racism isn't just about, not being able to get into that school or that job or that neighborhood, but the psychological impact is there too. And like I said, the American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as many people in the field of mental health, have looked at this, and it's all these things listed here. But I think the 2 at the bottom, or the 3 at the bottom, are the ones that we worry about the most. Because you may not think that these things have an impact on health outcomes, but the stress of racism and walking through your day sometimes and feeling like people look at you differently because of the color of your skin, or feeling like you're not safe or have to be on guard, it causes stress. And stress isn't just like a thing. It's actual hormones and chemicals in your body that are being released. And to have long-term exposure to that toxic hormone can cause inflammation. It can cause long-term health changes as an adult, which is why you see people of color tend to have higher rates of heart disease, diabetes, other types of illnesses that are associated with inflammation in the body. And this is because of all of the impact of racism and the systems that racism permeates, like housing, like poverty, like access to healthcare and things like that, that some of our students are interested in helping to address and eradicate. And the other thing is that without addressing racism, we just get more of the same, because we know this is something that's taught. We know this is something that kids learn. And so without any, changes, then we just get more of the same, which is why we continue to see the George Floyds, the Breonna Taylors, the Michael Browns. We continue to see the police brutality. We continue to see the things happening in our colleges and things of that nature. So we want to have the benefit of more experiences with people that don't look like us, but we also want our white counterparts to learn more about this system so that they can be a part of the change. And I'll just end with talking about the power of youth voice, because it's not all doom and gloom. Activism has been proven through research to actually help reduce anxiety related to racism, especially for Black children. It empowers them and it builds bridges between youth of varied racial backgrounds, especially when there's different kids coming together. We saw this happen a lot with things like March for Our Lives. When the shooting happened down in Parkland, we also saw kids come together from all different walks of life coming together for the Black Lives Matter movement this past year. It really does create change when you start to see kids deciding that they're going to raise their voices. And I just want to point out that sometimes when we watch these documentaries of these people that did all this work in the past, we think that it happened so long ago, and that they look older. So we're like, oh, they looked like they were 40 or they were 50 when they were, but you know, John Lewis was 25 years old when he walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He was a young man. I just recently watched a movie about a civil rights leader, Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party, who was 21 when he was killed, but he was starting to do a lot of things positive in the community in Chicago when he was in his late teens, early 20s. A lot of these civil rights leaders were not older people, but I think because we see the images, we think they were older, but they were young people. So the power of youth voice is very critical to any movement that we've ever had in the United States. And if you've seen Hamilton, that, you know, them talking about being young, scrappy, and hungry, those were teenagers and young 20-year-olds that led the American Revolution. So there's not been any revolution in our country that hasn't been started by young people that were thought to be too young to know or understand, yet here we are. So how can adults help? How can we help encourage our youth? Well, first of all, we need to get out of their way and, you know, allow them to use their voice and let them lead in ways that feel organic to them. There's more than one way to be an activist. You don't have to be the one holding the bullhorn. Maybe you're the person that helps to organize. Maybe you're the person that starts the club. Maybe you're the person that asks for a change in the books that you're reading in your English class for the year and really highlighting more Black voices or Black leaders in your social studies class. So however you can lead or be an activist, do it that way. There's more than one way to do this. And if you're not familiar with the understanding the Black Lives Matter movement, educate yourself and be aware of the algorithm. You know, we tend to see on social media the things that we click on the most. The algorithm is there to show us that content. So step outside of your comfort zone and make sure you really understand what the Black Lives Matter movement really is, as opposed to maybe what's coming up on your social media feed. And also do activism with them so that you can feel confident that they're being safe. So if they want to go to a protest, go with them and just take a step back and watch how they are, or park your car and just kind of peek over and see what they're doing. You'd be surprised. For kids that decide to engage in this kind of work, they're often more ready than we give them credit for. So I'm going to stop there and just say, I love Audre Lorde. I love every quote I've ever read of hers. She has some dynamic quotes around self-care and things like that. But I just want to say that this quote is one of my go-tos, and it's the quote I always kind of think about the most when I'm feeling anxious about using my voice. And it says, when I dare to be powerful to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. So fear can often stifle our voices, and we really want to encourage our youth to be strong, and even if they're afraid, to do it anyway. So I'll stop there and I'll stop sharing. So thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. So you sparked a question that we did not previously talk about, but I feel the need to bring it up, and that is the term Black Lives Matter. I know that, and some of the panelists, we've actually had conversations about this, but I guess my question is, how do we handle the term Black Lives matters in terms of people confusing it with an organization versus the idea of Black lives do matter. Can you speak a little bit about that? Because I do believe that there is some confusion, there is some mixing, and there are some people when they hear that term, it brings about a lot of agita, it brings about the whole political side of things, but I think it means so much more. And I just want to ask you to speak to that.
Yeah, I think that, the Black Lives Matter movement is kind of both a sentiment and it's an organization. So it's actually like an organization that rallies around like key incidences and was kind of created for that reason. But it's also a sentiment. So it's kind of like this. And then I think the sentiment is based on what you hear when you hear Black Lives Matter. So some people hear only Black Lives Matter, but some people hear Black Lives Matter too, or Black Lives Matter also. That idea of we're talking about the fact that people are not including Black lives when they think about who matters. And so when I've been in conversations or done trainings around, sort of cultural responsiveness and things like that, and mind you, I tend to work more so with my peers in mental health or students, but I think it's about like, who do you really want to have that conversation with? Because there's some people that are only trying to inquire about it because they want to fight with you about it. And so I think that getting in the weeds of what does Black Lives Matter and what about all lives matter and all that kind of stuff, I think my response is always like, what do you hear when you hear me say Black Lives Matter? Do you think I'm saying your life doesn't matter? Is that what you're hearing me say? But I'm the type of person that is comfortable being somewhat confrontational about that, because I think I want to know what it is you're hearing me say when I say Black Lives Matter. But I think it's just an extension of, the civil rights, sayings, movements that were happening then, this idea of inclusion and remembering that when you're talking about the lives of people, are you thinking about Black lives as being human and being a part of this and being deserving of the same rights as everyone else? But these sayings and movements don't come out of nowhere. So I think that's the part that I kind of never quite understand. But I choose carefully who I get into those conversations with, because some people ask because they really want to know, and some people ask because they really want to argue. And depending on my mood, I might choose to hold off on that conversation because it's exhausting for me and I have to take care of myself.
Absolutely. So I want to thank everybody for giving us their reflections. But I do have a few questions that I just want to throw out at the panel and just chime in how you feel. As we look upon history, and we remember people like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Rosa Parks, W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X. And, we recently remembered the horrific events that happened on Bloody Sunday and the sacrifices that people like John Lewis made on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. We see that there is a new dawn, and the baton is being passed on to a new generation of young people. My question to the panel is, how does your generation move this mission, move this movement forward?
Well, I think the first way to do that is to continue having these conversations and to continue seeking knowledge, because we don't know everything that happens in the world. So there's always, a chance to learn more. And by learning more, we learn, what's going on in the world and what needs to be fixed. And Dr. Moore touched on this in her presentation, but it's also important to find ways to incorporate social justice into the activities that we already like to do. So like John is interested in finance, and I know like through our meetings, he's talked about economic inequalities and, generational wealth. And that's a way that he incorporates that into what he already likes to do. And for me and Sheridan, we incorporated, learning about health inequalities because we like learning about medicine and stuff. So I think we have to keep moving forward by constantly learning and constantly, engaging in social justice through the things we do.
So I believe like for our specific generation, I think we have had the privilege of technology as utility in our movement. So especially social media is often kind of seen as like negative, a little bit toxic, and it has been definitely used for toxic behavior. But when it's used properly, it allows us to share like information and mobilize much easier and quicker than in the past. And it allows us to do our own research. And it's important that we use multiple sources and different perspectives and things of that nature. But it allows us to both do our own research and learn for ourselves with a lot of accessibility and really, really quickly. And we saw this last year after the murder of George Floyd. Three young ladies from Burlington Township started a protest on their own, and they utilized social media solely to get the word out. And there was a big turnout. A lot of people came, a lot of people supported. And so I think social media, specifically for our generation, has been what has propelled us and what has allowed us to just make really effective change for this movement.
And then also to build off of that, we need to start listening to people, not just hearing people. Now, of course, what do I mean by that? And I think too often people are just so fast to scream at people they don't agree with, or block them on social media. Like Sheridan said, the world of social media is a very big place, and it's very easy to just get people out of your way. And as Dr. Moore had said, there are multiple different things that we can do, whether it be online or talking with people, in order to gain new perspectives. And I'm honestly, I really don't like the amount of cancel culture I see nowadays, especially from kids our age. And I think we can really improve upon this. And even though if we don't agree with people, like I may not agree with somebody, but it's still the idea of listening to what the other person has to say, listening to what the other side has to say. And if in doing that, we can progress forward, we can take that first step in moving this mission forward. And I think without listening to other people and broadening our horizons, there's no way that we can make any progress in the first place.
Thank you all. That you have really given us some things to think about, and you guys are very deep. I'm loving it. So my next question is this: many people have said, and I can say I have said this, the events over the past year. I'm in my 50s. I've seen this. My parents are in their 70s. They've lived it in a different light. But what happened last year seems so different. The reaction seems so different. And in my opinion, and in the opinion of others that I've had this discussion with, we all believe that the difference is your generation. Why do you think this is the sentiment that people have about what's happening now?
Sorry, I'll start this time. Sorry, Grace. Grace, would you like to go?
No, you can go.
All right, sorry. So as Sheridan had already touched on this over the last question, but I definitely believe it's social media. It has been so easy for people to come together, connect, discuss, form their opinions, and just utilize social media in so many different ways that it hasn't been able to have been used in the past. And I prepared a little like question. I think if you ask a high school student who Jim Gardner, Cecily Tynan, Deuces Rogers, and David Murphy are, they wouldn't know who you're talking about. And it's mainly because people are not watching the news anymore. They're on social media all the time. And it's really no fault of their own. I mean, kids this age just use Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and those are the sources that people are using to get their news. social media has just had such a large influence on our youth, and whether it's a good or a bad thing is totally up to the eye of the beholder. But it is the main generation, at least to me, why, or it is the main reason to me why our generation is just so different from previous generations.
And John, I noticed that you did not mention Facebook, which a lot of us older folks use.
Actually, did you recognize the 6 ABC News people?
You know what? I absolutely did. Every single one of them.
Fantastic. See, that's what I thought, because a lot of kids my age, they don't know them, but I figured all the adults would know them.
We do.
Well, kind of coming off of what John said, it definitely is social media because we can easily just get information like that. Like, we don't have to go to a library and get a book, it's at the tip of our fingers. And so I think that also really propelled the protests last summer because everyone saw the video of George Floyd being murdered because it was on social media. And I think that really amplified the reaction to it. And I also think it's because our generation, I mean, we're young, but we have lived through a lot so far in our 18 years. I mean, when we were 5, we lived through a recession, and now we're living through a pandemic and, you know, a bunch of other events. So I think this cultivation of like many years of going through things has built us to become, you know, strong in activism and, you know, want to gain knowledge on these topics.
Yeah, so backing off what Grace and John said, I think technology definitely had one of the most important roles in this past year. Like Grace said, like these incidents are no longer just word of mouth, they're actually being caught on camera. So it can't just be denied simply off of prejudice of somebody thinking that they're lying or they're making up a story or exaggerating. It's actually caught on camera. And also, I think our generation is kind of a little bit more integrated than the past. I think maybe in the civil rights movement, it was like mostly just people of color that were leading the movement and propelling it for change. But now, and it was also mostly just Black versus white. And I feel like now in our new generation and in the utilization of technology, we see that not only is it Black people and white people coming together and just making really good change and coming together and speaking their minds. I think it's also people of different cultures, Asians, Native Americans are all being celebrated and included in this change. And I think our generation is a little bit less segregated, a little bit less separated than before. And I think that inclusion together, especially with the example of Burlington Township, like we're really super diverse, and that has really like it's really helped with the Black Student Union and the discussions that we've had. So I think the integration of our new generation has really helped with this movement specifically.
So I guess my next question is I always like to look ahead to the future. And as I said earlier, you are the future. What can we do to ensure that we continue having these types of critical conversations? Obviously, you know, these conversations can make people uncomfortable. A lot of times people don't want to talk about the idea of privilege or white privilege. They don't want to have the conversations about racism and, you know, whether things are equal, whether they're not. So these are difficult conversations. And my mantra has always been, you know, in your discomfort is when you grow. So my question to all of you is, how do we ensure that we continue having these conversations with young people, with more seasoned folks, when it comes to issues of racism, issues of equity, diversity, equality, and inclusion? How do we keep this going?
Well, kind of going off what you said, people are hesitant to talk about these topics. They tend to feel more uncomfortable, but I think the key is to create spaces where people feel comfortable. And that's why we created the Black Student Union, for people to express these sentiments. And through our meetings, people tend to be hesitant to talk about stuff because our topics are very serious. John knows, he's nodding his head. People tend to, be hesitant to speak out, but we always try to encourage them that it's okay to express your opinion or to, talk about something that you've experienced, because we're not here to judge, we're here to listen to each other. So I think it's just most important to make it known that it is a safe space to discuss such topics.
Grace, can you tell us what are some of the hot topics that the BSU find themselves talking about?
Well, one that's really coming to mind is for Black History Month, one of our meetings, we discussed the African diaspora. And our other co-founder, Francine Bacon, she, typed a discussion question, and it was like, do you think people a part of the African diaspora should be allowed to say the N-word? And that conversation lasted for like 15 minutes, and everybody was just going back and forth. And that was definitely an interesting topic. And our first meeting also talked about cultural appropriation and when it's okay to, appreciate somebody's culture, or the difference between appreciating and appropriating. And those are some of the more serious topics we've discussed.
Okay. Thank you.
So kind of the same thing that Grace said. I think the environments where people can just come together and feel safe talking about their different perspectives on topics, I think that's the way we can just continue having these conversations. Because if people don't feel comfortable, or people think they're going to be judged based on what they've learned growing up or in social media, that they're not really going to be open to having these conversations, and we're not really going to be able to benefit. So I think to continue that, we have to have a safe space. And I also really like what Grace said earlier about kind of integrating that within your own personal interests. So like she said, like, we are really interested in STEM. So if we want to grow up and be a health professional, we should probably integrate medical ethics and health disparities and inequalities in that study. And like John said, he's interested in finance and accounting. So including generational wealth and stuff like that in your interest is really, really important, and continue it, because then you can just bring it all the way through your life, all the way through your future, in your education and in your career. So I think those are just really important ways to continue these conversations.
Yeah, definitely having those safe spaces where we can all discuss is definitely a big thing. But another thing is, within those safe spaces and outside of those safe spaces, we need people to respect each other. I think what a lot is happening in the world right now, there's a lot of a lack of respect, and it sort of ties into my idea from earlier, listening to others. But I believe respect goes a lot further than just listening. It's acknowledging each other as people who have feelings and opinions just like us, and knowledge and standards just like us. It's knowing that there's a human being across from you, rather than just discarding them because they have a different viewpoint than you. And it's having these experiences in the past couple of months has really, I guess, broadened my horizon, and I've come to the realization that some of the people that I disagree with the most, they have their own unique perspectives, and I would really be foolish to pass up an opportunity to potentially learn something new. I'm just gonna say it. I went into the Black Student Union having really low expectations, but then I found, like, wow, this is a place where we can really discuss serious topics, and I can learn new things from other people, and it became a sort of a new home for me. And I really appreciate the opportunities that Grace, Sheridan, Francine, and everyone else has given the students here at BTHS. I think it's a really great thing.
I
Thank
was
you.
laughing at that because honestly, starting this in a pandemic, we didn't know what to expect either. I mean, we officially had our first meeting in November, but we brought our proposal in June, and we've been waiting for months. So we honestly didn't know what to expect. So hearing that from you was just very interesting.
Yeah, and that about summed up everything. But I will say, definitely respect is the number one thing that we need. Without respect, I don't think any progress can be made at all.
Listening to all of you, and I apologize for my dog, everyone. Um, the one thing that is what I see and that I feel in the deepest portion of my heart is hope. And listening to the conversations that you're involved in right now tells me that there is definitely hope. There is a light out there when it comes to these issues. And the fact that, you know, I give the three of you so much credit because there are a lot of adults who would not feel comfortable having this type of discourse. They would not feel comfortable just putting it out there and saying, hey, let's talk about this. So the fact that you all are just willing to do this tells me that our future is bright, that the marathon, when we pass that torch on to you, not when we do it, it's being done now, that there is definitely hope. And it's refreshing. It is so refreshing just to hear what you are saying.
And your perspectives are so awesome. Like when I think about back to when I was 17 or 18 years old, I don't think I would have been having these conversations. One, because I was too afraid. Two, because it just there wasn't the opportunity to have them. And the fact that you guys are all going on educating yourselves. And John, like you said, even listening to people, I'm an adult now, and typically I like to stay away from conversations that I don't agree with. But I had a conversation with some of my family members where normally I just wanted to scream and yell at them for some of their reactions. But then I sat back and I just listened, and I listened to their perspective. When normally I would just run away and pretend to clean dishes. I sat down and I was listening to them, and I was engaging in conversations and just asking questions because I wanted to understand a little bit more their thought process. And I don't think I ever would have done that in my entire life. But I think a lot of it does have to do with watching so many of our students have those conversations and not be afraid to do those things. So keep doing it, guys. You guys are all doing such an awesome job with this because you may not see it, but you are inspiring adults. You really are.
And actually, just to let everyone know in the chat, and I want to thank our attendees for using the chat feature. Grace, someone said to you, absolutely, this generation are 21st century learners. They've been given the tools at a young age to solve problems, make decisions. They are more than equipped to do. Someone else said 100%, the younger generation does not view skin tone or background the way the older generations do. This may be because of not directly living through the inequality or racism. Today's inequality and racism is still alive and doing well, just not so blatant. However, the past year, we all saw how social media brought it to the forefront for everyone. And I have to add to that, also being in the middle of a pandemic, what happened last summer has been going on forever. And there are many Black folks that said, okay, this isn't new. But the fact that we were and still are on somewhat of a lockdown, we were forced to pay attention to this, everyone. And that made a definite difference as well. And again, seeing the rainbow of people out there screaming about social justice, making movements about social justice, made, again, what I said earlier, made this feel so different.
Liz, I just wanted to speak to that statement. I really appreciate that statement about how things may not be as in your face. It's more, it's not as blatant. And that's something I think as young people to just be on the lookout for. I talk about how racism is somewhat insidious now. It's like a snake in the grass where you may not notice it until you step on it. And in some cases. And so an example of that, just to kind of offer like a way that this kind of shows up in a way that may not be so obvious, but I have an older child that plays sports, travel sports and things like that. and he plays soccer, which in our country is typically, not, you don't see a lot of soccer teams in his flights with children of color. And the township team, of course, is like the most diverse team all over everywhere we go. And what we found is that over the years, as the team has gotten older and they've played more competitively, that the calls they get against them, the fouls that are called against them, the cards that they might get, they may be doing the same thing as other players, but because they're young boys of color, some of them, and that's the other thing too, the boys of color on the team get more of the fouls called on them than the other kids on the same team do. And so this is a subtle way how the aggression or the viewing of aggression in young Black boys is viewed very differently through the eyes of the referees that are often not referees that represent those groups. And so that's not just here, though. You hear about that all the time, and differences in how in youth sports, how this happens. And so that's an example of a very subtle way that racism is alive and well in this not so blatant way, as one of our attendees mentioned. So just keeping an eye out for these subtle ways, because sometimes we're looking for like the obvious, but sometimes it's this very subtle things. It's the things you're learning in school. Are you reading literature from Black authors, or is it like the same like 3 prominent authors that everybody's heard of, but you're not really learning about like these hidden figures in our history that contributed to our country and its greatness? And so these subtle ways that there's an either erasure of the impact of Black and Brown Americans, or there is sort of a kind of leaning towards thinking about what we do as being more aggressive, more, in need of being disciplined or suspended from school. These are these subtle ways that racism is still showing up in our policies and our practices across various sectors. And I think that's where the work is still very much in need to be done, because that's the snake in the grass that we don't always notice right away.
Absolutely. Someone else put in the chat, as a 98 Falcon, and it's Miss Giddens from the middle school folks, I'm gonna call her out. She's so amazed and proud of you. Wow. And she's right. Many of these conversations didn't happen until she went to college and joined the Black Student Union and the National Council of Negro Women. You are so advanced and so self-aware. Mrs. Bell also typed in the chat, she's very proud of all of you. Great and important conversations and insights. So you all are you're just moving things forward. And as I said before, we definitely have hope. There is hope. Does anybody have any closing thoughts before we wrap up the session?
No, I would just like to thank everyone for coming out and learning from a student's perspective about how we feel about these things.
Yeah, we're all definitely very appreciative. I'm very appreciative of being invited on here and then actually having the chance to discuss with everybody. I think that's a real great thing that I don't think I've ever had the opportunity to do that. So I really appreciate that as well. And then, of course, for everybody coming out, I really appreciate you taking the time to come out and listen to us. And I think there's some Q&A involved later. We'll see.
Well, if any of our attendees have questions that you want to throw out there, right now there's nothing else. It's just a lot of praise for all of you. Someone just said you are teen superstars, and that is so true. But attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. Sheridan?
I just wanted to, I'm sorry, Sheridan, go ahead. I was going to say something, but I'll go after you.
I just want to say thank you to everyone, and say thank you to Miss Scott and Miss George for kind of just leading us and giving us this opportunity. It's really exciting to be able to be a part of it. And thank you for everyone's kind words in the chat. Everyone's really sweet, and I really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you for coming out.
I just wanted to thank John, Grace, and Sheridan for having this event, for being leaders, and just for the invitation to be here with you all. I don't think I'm old or, an older person, but clearly I am compared to you all. And so, while I'd like to think I'm forever young, I think anytime I'm in a conversation, I work with kids and I work with young adults. And so listening to you talk about what you're doing, your interests, like everyone has said, it just gives me so much pride and hope for what's to come. And so I really appreciate each of you and the work you're doing at the high school. I have kids that'll be in the high school at some point as they grow up. And so it's nice to hear what's happening at the high school and the legacy you all are leaving behind as you move forward in your schooling. And I just want to tell you to keep being great. So thank you.
So someone just asked about the recording being made available, and we will definitely, once we render the video and cut some of our bloopers out in the beginning, this will be added to our Critical Conversations video library. We did a session last week on COVID, and we have some other sessions that are also out there. So we'll be sending it out through the Falcon Flyer, letting you know that it is now available. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us on this journey. I definitely want to send a heartfelt thank you to all of our panelists. You guys are definitely rock stars. And Miss Ray wants to thank all of you. And once again, her cup is filled with knowing that people are connecting one way or another in our BT community. She says she's so proud of all of you, wants you to keep moving your world forward. And this is just the feeling. And again, as I said earlier, it's about hope, and you all are definitely giving us hope. I want to let everyone know that we will be sending out a survey asking for feedback on the session, and asking you to share with us what other topics that you would like us to bring forth through a critical conversations. But I want to challenge each and every person who's on this call, and I'm giving you some homework. It's the teacher in me. I want you to pay attention to your feelings and be aware of your emotions as you watch the news and you see the different things that are happening. I want you to pay attention to how you interact with others. I want you to be observant of those around you. Journal about it, talk about it. I challenge every single one of you to try to have a difficult conversation with someone who does not look like you. And remember, we are all in this together. I want to thank everyone again. I want to thank our amazing superstar students for having the courage to speak out and for being a part of the narrative to bring about change. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you again. Good night.
I did see a question.
Oh, wait a minute. In regards to the topic of books by little to no Black authors as students, what can we do to change the already instilled curriculum? So I'm going to attempt to answer that, and I'm hoping people are still here. The district this year is actually working diligently in all of the buildings with our media specialists to look at our collections. And we are working diligently to correct this so that our students, when they go to the media centers, they are able to see books that have people that look like them, that have different lifestyles like them, to ensure that our collections are representative of the diversity that we experience. We are well experienced here in Burlington Township. So that is definitely something that we are actively working on with our media specialist, who is she's a member of our equity team, but she's a huge advocate when it comes to these issues. So we're definitely working on that. John, thank you for catching that. Mr. O'Donnell wants to know, what is a book, documentary, movie, or a podcast the panelists would recommend for us to read and watch?
I saw a movie recently called Invictus about how Nelson Mandela changed South Africa. And I think that was an amazing film. Not sure if it's school appropriate. I mean, but I thought it was a really great film, and it showed how we can get away from that idea of segregation and promote the well-being of everyone and um, the I'm trying to think of a word, like the cooperation, I guess might be a good word. The Yeah, working together in order to better society.
I recommend a movie that came out recently. It's called Judas and the Black Messiah, and Dr. Moore touched on this earlier. It's about Fred Hampton, who is in charge of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. And it's not on HBO Max anymore. I forget where you can watch it now, but it's a really good movie. And I also recently read a book called The Vanishing Half, which I would really recommend.
So I just read a book it's called Just Medicine, and it says it's Just Medicine: A Cure for Racial Inequality in American Healthcare. So it kind of shows my little bit of my nerd side a little bit, but it's really good. It's really dense. There's a lot of information, but it's really cool and it's really insightful for learning about how you can create change in health inequities. So it's really good.
Someone else put in the chat the 13th. That's on Netflix. And also there's a new the new Jim Crow is a great book by Michelle Alexander. And I would also like to recommend The Soul of a Nation. That is actually, it comes on, I believe it's Tuesday nights. I can't remember which network, but if you just, new technology, just speak into your remote to get to it. But The Soul of a Nation is,
Oh, it's so
again,
good.
yeah, the conversations is phenomenal. So, and I also recommend on YouTube Uncomfortable Conversations with the Black Man. That series is just spectacular. He actually just turned that into a book. So I do definitely recommend those. Kelly, the question that came up was,
I'm sorry, was I supposed to stay on?
well, questions just started.
I'm
So,
so sorry.
hey, we're going to go with it. What books,
Sorry, everyone.
documentaries or movies or podcasts do you recommend for people to read or watch?
I think you said the one I was thinking I would have thought of immediately, Soul of a Nation. I just started watching that.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I think the 1619 podcast on Apple or wherever you get podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
It's about 6 episodes. I think that's a really, if you're into podcasts, I think that's a great one to listen to. And then another podcast that I think talks about history and is, I believe that it's called American Scandal, but the different seasons focus on different moments in history. But there's a season about the Tuskegee experiments, which I thought was really well done. And I actually learned a lot that I didn't know about it. And there's one that they just did that's called The United States versus Activists, and talks about sort of the FBI program created by J. Edgar Hoover to go after various activists, one of whom is Billie Holiday. Fred Hampton is another one. Martin Luther King is another one. And it's told by a historian, and it's really good.
One of our attendees also recommended Imitation of Life. It's an oldie but goodie, and it has to be with parental permission, of course. And again, I want to thank everyone, and please remember to do your homework and drop me an email and say, hey, Liz, I had that uncomfortable conversation with someone and it helped me grow, because that's what it's all about. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. And we look forward to welcoming you to additional critical conversations that we will continue to have in the district. Good night, everyone.